It's a funny thing, time. Out there in the fields before the fighting started, it could drag on like mud, each minute an hour, each hour a day, just waiting for the order to move. But inside the Panzer, in the thick of it, it changed. It became something else entirely. It compressed. It stretched. That last moment, the one right before the hit, I remember it with a kind of perfect, terrible clarity. We were buttoned up. The world shrunk to the dimensions of this steel box, maybe 5 meters by 3. The air was already thick with the smells of men and machine sweat. Oil, the sharp tang of cordite from the main gun we'd just fired, the stale bitterness of old coffee from the tin mug clipped to the radio. Erich, our loader, was humming some folk tune from home, his shoulders straining as he hauled another shell into the breach. Franz, our driver, had that look of intense concentration, his hands white-knuckled on the levers, the engine roaring in our ears like a captured beast. Me, I was at the radio, the headphones clamped on, the static hiss a constant companion, waiting for the Oberleutnant's voice to crackle through with new orders. There was a rhythm to it all, a terrible, grinding rhythm we'd all learned. The lurch as Franz shifted gears, the deafening boom that punched you in the chest when the gun fired, the hot, spent casing clattering to the floor, the smell. Always the smell. Then a different sound, not the roar of our own engine or the crump of a distant explosion. This was a high-pitched shriek, coming in fast, the sound of metal tearing through the air straight for you. It's a sound you feel in your teeth. The world didn't just slow down then, it stopped. Frozen. Erich's humming cut off. Franz's hands went still. In that sliver of a second, you're not a soldier anymore, you're just an animal waiting for the blow to fall. And then it came. Not an explosion, not at first. It was a sound I'll hear on my deathbed. Deafening, resonant clang like someone had struck the side of our Panzer with a guard's own hammer. The whole 4 to 5 tons of steel shuddered, a bell tolling just for us. That was the calm, the last calm we'd ever know. The chaos that followed wasn't like in the training films. It was immediate and total. I was thrown forward, my head cracking against the radio set, a flash of white pain behind my eyes. The lights flickered, died, then came back on, casting a sickly, dancing glow from the emergency batteries. The air, which had been hot before, was now an oven. A new smell hit me, a horrible cocktail of scorched metal, like a blacksmith shop on fire, and the acrid, suffocating stink of fresh cordite from the enemy shell that had just punched through our armor. And then the screams. Not shouts of alarm, but raw, high-pitched screams of agony. I looked over and saw Klaus, our gunner, slumped over his sights, a twisted piece of shrapnel, still glowing cherry red, buried in his back. His uniform was already smoldering. Erich wasn't screaming. He was just staring at his leg, which was bent at an impossible angle, bone poking through the fabric. The fight for the village, for the objective, for the fatherland, it all vanished from my mind in that instant. It was replaced by a much simpler, more primal fight, the fight for the next breath, because the air was turning to poison. Smoke, thick and black, started pouring from the engine compartment firewall, and with it came the smell of burning rubber and electrical wiring, a sweet, nauseating odor that clawed at the back of your throat. The realization hit me like a physical blow. We weren't soldiers in a tank anymore. We were men in a metal coffin, and it was beginning to burn. My training, what was left of it, screamed one word: Ostig escape, the main hatch above me. I shoved Klaus's body aside, my hands fumbling for the release handle. It was already hot to the touch, but I grabbed it, heaving with all my strength. It didn't budge. The impact must have warped the frame, jamming it shut. Panic, cold and sharp, shot through me. I tried again, putting my shoulder into it, a desperate, guttural cry tearing from my lungs. Nothing. I looked at my palm. The skin was seared, blistered white from the heat of the metal handle. The terror of that moment is a taste, like sucking on a copper penny. We were locked in, trapped, and the fire was no longer just smoke. It was a living thing. It wasn't like a campfire, clean and bright. This was a creeping, liquid heat. It spilled from the driver's compartment, a wave of orange and yellow that licked along the ceiling, dripping down like molten honey. It melted everything it touched. The rubber padding around the vision blocks bubbled and boiled away. The paint on the walls blistered and peeled, revealing the stark grey metal beneath. The heat was unbearable, a physical weight pressing down, sucking the moisture from your eyes, your mouth. Your lungs felt like they were full of sand. Then came the sounds that truly signaled the end. The ammunition. The shells stacked neatly in their racks began to cook off. It started with small pops, like firecrackers, the machine gun belts igniting. Each pop was a promise, a little messenger telling you that the big one, the main gun shell that would tear this tin can apart, was coming. The air itself seemed to shimmer with the heat. I could feel the skin on my face tightening, blistering. My eyebrows were gone in an instant. France was still in his seat, engulfed in flames, a silent, burning statue. Erich had stopped moving. It was just me and the fire and the popping and the unbearable knowledge that this was it. I don't know where the strength came from. Despair, maybe. Or maybe it was the image of my mother's face that flashed behind my eyes. I braced my boots against the radio set, put my back against the hatch, and pushed. I pushed with everything I had left, with every memory, every hope, every regret. I screamed, a raw animal sound lost in the roar of the fire. And then, with a screech of tortured metal, it gave way. A sliver of daylight, grey and smoky, but daylight all the same, pierced the hellish gloom. I shoved again, and the hatch flew open. The air that hit me was thick with the smoke of the battlefield, but I gulped it down anyway. It burned my throat worse than the fire inside, but it was air. Freedom. I hauled myself out, my uniform smouldering, my hands screaming in pain as they gripped the blistering hot steel of the turret. I half fell, half crawled over the side, my body tumbling down the sloped armor, hitting the ground with a jarring thud. I didn't feel the shrapnel in my leg then. That came later. All I felt was the desperate, frantic need to get away. I scrambled on my hands and knees, putting distance between me and the wreck. After a few meters, I dared to look back. My Panzer, our Panzer. It was a funeral pyre. Flames shot 20 feet into the air from every hatch, black smoke billowing into the sky. I could see the silhouettes of my comrades inside, dark shapes against the orange inferno. These were the men I had shared bread with that morning. France, who'd shown me a photograph of his newborn daughter just yesterday, his face beaming with a pride that seemed 1,000 years away now. Erich, who'd been joking about the terrible coffee, claiming his mother. S was so strong it could kickstart a dead engine. Klaus, quiet Klaus, who just wanted to get back to his books. They were all in there, and I was out here. The guilt that washed over me then was a heat that dwarfed the flames. It was a cold fire that settled in my bones, a shame that I had lived when they had not. I just stood there, shaking, watching their tomb burn. The shaking didn't stop for a long time. Hours, days, maybe. Someone from an infantry unit found me just stumbling through the smoke, my face black with soot, my eyes wide and vacant. They got me to a field hospital. The physical wounds healed, more or less. The palms scarred over. The shrapnel in my leg was dug out. But other things stayed. The taste, for one. For days I could taste nothing but soot and blood. It was in my mouth, my throat, a constant gritty reminder. They'd give me soup, fresh bread, but all I could taste was the inside of that Panzer. And the smell, that's the worst of it, the thing that followed me home. You can close your eyes to what you've seen, but you can't close your nose to what you've smelled. The smell of burnt flesh and gasoline is a perfume that clings to your soul. It's there in my dreams, even now, 50 years later. I'll be back in my kitchen, or tending my garden, and a whiff of something overheated metal from a car, the smell of a bonfire will trigger it, and I'm right back there. I'll wake up in a cold sweat, my heart hammering, that smell still in my nostrils. Surviving, it leaves you hollow. It's not a triumph, it's a burden. You carry the faces of the men who didn't make it. You carry the sound of their screams. You carry the weight of the why. Why me? Why did I get to push that hatch open? There's no answer that satisfies. There's just the hollow feeling, the quiet of a life lived after, a life they were denied. No medal, no victory parade, no flag-waving speech from some general miles behind the lines was worth a single minute inside that tin can of hell. We were just boys, you see. We weren't heroes or monsters. We were just boys, far from home, stuck in a metal box, trying to survive. And some of us did. But a part of us, the best part maybe, burned up right along with the rest of them. You never forget the first time you see a green replacement. It's like looking in a mirror from a year ago, and the reflection makes you feel old, older than your 20 years have any right to make you feel. This one came to us in the mud and drizzle of early spring, his uniform still holding the sharp creases from the depot, his face pale and unlined, a boy from Hamburg who looked like he'd just been pulled from behind a school desk. He had that look in his eyes, a mixture of eagerness and sheer terror, trying so hard to be a soldier that he forgot to just be a man. Our commander, Unteroffizier Bauer, a man who'd been with this panzer since Africa, with the dust of the desert still etched into the crow's feet around his eyes, he just watched him. He didn't say a word, just measured him with a quiet, tired gaze. Bauer had a way of looking at you that had nothing to do with rank or training manuals. He was weighing the calm in your soul, seeing if you had the stillness inside to withstand the storm that was coming. We all knew whose bunk the kid was taking. It had been Muller's, a funny little guy from Köln who could make you laugh even when the rations were thin and the Russians were close. A piece of shrapnel from a grenade found its way through a vision port during a scouting mission near Kharkov, and just like that, Muller was gone, and his bunk was empty. We'd already parceled out his personal effects to send back, all except the photograph of his girl, Liesel, which we kept tucked in the radio compartment. We didn't tell the new boy any of that, not then. The ghosts of the men who'd sat in these seats before him were our business, a silent weight we carried. He'd meet them soon enough on his own terms. Those first few days were about the sounds, the smells, the feel of the machine that was now our shared home. The official training, all that nonsense they drilled into you at the panzer schools, it was useless here at the front. The real lessons started right away. I remember pulling the kid aside. His name was Klaus, and I showed him how to really listen to the Maybach engine. You don't just hear an engine, you learn its language. There's the normal grumbling clatter, the sound of power and life. But then there's the other sounds, the ones that mean death. You learn to pick out the high-pitched metallic whine of a final drive about to fail, a sound that's worse than any artillery shell because it means you're going nowhere, a sitting duck in a metal coffin. I made him put his hand on the engine block, feel the vibrations. "This hum," I told him, "this is a good sound. This is the sound of getting home." He nodded, serious, trying to absorb it all. Then there was the small leather pouch we all wore, not the official one for pistol cartridges. Bauer showed him that one. He opened his own, frayed and soft with sweat. Inside wasn't ammunition. It was a photograph of his wife and a little girl he'd only seen in pictures, and a single, carefully folded letter, the last one he'd received before the mail routes turned to chaos. "This," Bauer said, his voice low and gravelly, "this is what you fight for. Not for the fatherland, not for the Führer. You fight for the picture. You keep it close to your heart, understand?" Klaus nodded again, and that night I saw him carefully tucking a photograph of his own into the new pouch his mother had probably given him. It was a ritual, a silent initiation. And before a push, when the air was thick with the smell of diesel and cold fear, Bauer would break out his precious cigarettes. They were like gold, but he never smoked them alone. He'd pass them around, one for each of us, and we'd light up in the dim red light of the fighting compartment. No one spoke. We just smoked, the glow of the tips reflecting in our eyes. That shared cigarette was a sacrament. It said, "We are in this together. Whatever happens out there, we face it as a crew." It said more about brotherhood than any patriotic speech ever could. His baptism of fire came on a grey morning that smelled of wet earth and cordite. We were supporting an infantry advance near some godforsaken village whose name I've long forgotten. The first artillery barrage came without warning, the dreaded screech followed by the earth-shaking crump of the impacts. Inside the Panzer, it's a special kind of hell. You're not in the open, you're trapped in a metal box that rings like a church bell being struck by a giant. Every hit, even a near miss, sends a shockwave through the steel, a deafening clang that vibrates in your teeth. The smell is overpowering hot metal, sweat, cordite fumes seeping in, the sharp tang of your own fear. I looked over at Klaus. He was manning the machine gun, his knuckles white on the grips, his eyes wide as saucers. With every shell that landed close, he'd flinch, a full-body shudder. He was breathing in short, ragged gasps. I thought he might panic, might freeze up, or worse. But then Bauer's voice came over the intercom, calm and steady as if he were discussing the weather. He wasn't giving orders. He was just talking. "Easy now, boys. That one was 100 meters off. They're walking them in, but they're slow. Hands, you see anything on the right flank? Just trees. Good. Klaus, check your ammunition belt, make sure it's feeding smoothly." His voice was an anchor in the chaos. He was giving us something to focus on, something mundane to pull us back from the edge. He was teaching Klaus and reminding all of us how to stay human inside that screaming metal tomb. When the barrage lifted and we engaged the enemy infantry. It was a blur of noise and motion, the sharp crack of our main gun, the staccato of the machine guns, the frantic shouting over the intercom. And then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The silence that followed was almost more deafening than the battle. We were all drenched in sweat, our ears ringing. Klaus slowly let go of the machine gun, his hands trembling. He looked at me, then at Bauer, and then at me again. And in that look there was no more fear, just a deep, exhausted understanding. He'd been tested. He hadn't broken. He'd done his job. We didn't slap him on the back or cheer. Bauer just gave a slow, deliberate nod. That was all that was needed. The boy from Hamburg was gone. In his place was a Panzer crewman. He was one of us now. The weeks turned into a grim routine of movement, brief moments of terror, and long stretches of bone-deep weariness. Klaus lost the fresh-scrubbed look quickly. The grime of the front gets into your pores, under your nails, a permanent layer of oil, dust, and sweat that no amount of washing can remove. He learned the dark humor that keeps you sane. He started making jokes about the rations, about the mud, even about the Ivans. That's when you know a man has settled in, when he can find something to laugh about in the middle of the misery. We talk about home, not in grand, patriotic terms, but in the small, intimate details. Klaus would talk about the smell of the bakery next to his parents' house, the taste of a specific beer from a local brewery, the way the light came through his window in the morning. I'd talk about a girl I'd left behind, the sound of her laugh. Bauer would sometimes, in a rare, unguarded moment, talk about his daughter's first steps, a memory he held on to like a holy relic. Those conversations were our real sustenance, more important than the thin stew or the hard bread. We were fighting for those memories, for the hope of returning to that normalcy. The war, with all its grand strategy and politics, meant nothing inside our Panzer. Our world was 5 men, a machine, and the desperate will to see the next sunrise. The day it happened, the day the war truly changed for Klaus, was a day like any other, which is how it always happens. We were caught in a nasty ambush. A hidden anti-tank gun had found our flank. First shot was a glancing blow that rocked us and sent sparks flying inside the compartment. The second hit was worse. I remember the sound, a sickening solid punch of metal tearing through metal. The Panzer lurched violently. There was a scream that was cut short too quickly. Smoke and the acrid smell of burning insulation filled the air. "Ostagen, everybody out," Bauer yelled, but his voice was strained. A sliver of hot metal had sliced through his leg, pinning him to his seat. He was bleeding badly. For a second, chaos threatened to take us. The driver was already scrambling out of his hatch. But Klaus, instead of following him, turned to Bauer. His face was smeared with soot and sweat, but his eyes were clear. He didn't panic. He moved with a purpose I hadn't seen in him before. "I need a tourniquet," he barked at me, and I fumbled for a belt, my hands shaking. He applied it to Bauer's thigh, his movements quick and sure. Then, with a strength I didn't know he had, he hauled our commander out of his seat, supporting his weight. "Go, I've got him," he shouted at me, and we scrambled out of the burning hatch, hitting the ground as machine gun bullets pinged off our hull. We dragged Bauer to a shell crater, the 3 of us, while the other 2 crewmen laid down covering fire. We got him back to the aid station. He lost the leg, but he lived. As we stood there, watching the medics take him away, covered in his blood and the grime of the battle, I looked at Klaus. He wasn't a boy anymore. The last of that youthful softness had been burned away. There was a new hardness around his mouth, a gravity in his eyes that reflected my own. He was a veteran now, as much as any of us. He had carried the weight, and he hadn't buckled. In that moment, I realized something profound and terrible. We were all just temporary occupants of those seats in the Panzer. Bauer had kept his warm for a long time, and he had passed on what he knew to us. Now, it was our turn. Klaus was no longer the green replacement. He was a soldier who would now have to teach the next scared boy who showed up with a clean uniform. Survival was a lesson you learned in blood, and the only thing you could do with that lesson was pass it on, a torch you carried for a while before handing it to the next man, hoping against hope that he'd be strong enough to carry it a little further, a little closer to home. We climbed back into replacement Panzer the next day, the ghosts of our old crew whispering around us, and Klaus took his place in the commander's seat. He didn't say much. He just looked at each of us, the way Bauer used to, measuring the calm in our souls. And the war went on. You want to know what kept you sane out there? It wasn't the food. God knows it wasn't the food, and it sure as hell wasn't the fighting. No, it was the mail. A few thin sheets of paper, so light in your hand, but they carried the weight of the entire world you'd left behind. The whole damn war, it felt like, was just the miserable, muddy, bloody space between one letter and the next. The ritual of it, that was everything. You'd find a quiet spot, if such a thing existed. Maybe a corner of a barn that still smelled faintly of hay and animals, a blessed relief from the stink of cordite and sweat and damp wool. Or deep in a trench, using an empty ration crate as a desk, your back against the cold, wet earth. Just a few minutes of silence just for you. Getting out that precious paper, trying to keep it dry, smoothing it out on the rough wood. That was the first battle. Then came the real struggle, finding the words. How do you describe any of it? The sound a shell makes when it's just a little too close, a scream that tears the world in half. The way the ground shakes and you feel it in your teeth. The sight of a buddy laughing one minute and the next just gone. You couldn't write about that. You wouldn't. We all became masters of the lie of omission. We crafted these careful, sanitized little stories. The weather is cold, but we're managing. Managing. What a word. Trying to describe the indescribable without terrifying her, without letting the grey fear that lived in your gut leak out onto the page. The worst was when you had a piece of paper she'd sent you. Sometimes it would still hold the faintest trace of her perfume. Just a whisper of it. You'd bring the paper up to your nose, close your eyes, and for a second, you weren't in that frozen hell. You were back in the kitchen, the sun coming through the window, the smell of coffee and bread and her. It was a physical pain, that smell, a punch to the chest. It was a reminder of a life that felt like a dream, someone else's life, a story you'd been told once but couldn't quite believe was real anymore. You'd have to force yourself to pull the paper away, to start writing your bland little lies, your voice feeling hollow and foreign in your own head. And then there were the letters we never sent. Every one of us had them. Crumpled pages stuffed in the bottom of our packs, hidden away like a shameful secret. Those were the pages filled with the truth. The pages where you poured out the real horror, the gut-wrenching fear when the morning mist was so thick you couldn't see 10 feet, and you knew the Ivans were out there, moving, creeping closer. The bitter, ugly bitterness at the officers, at the whole filthy mess, at God himself for letting it happen. The graphic, bloody details of what happened to Klaus, or Hans, or Friedrich. How you tried to put him back together with your bare hands, the stickiness of it all, the sound he made, a wet, gurgling rasp that didn't even sound human. You'd write it all down, your hands shaking, the words coming out in a desperate flood, a poison you had to get out of your system. But you'd never send it. You'd read it over, this raw, screaming confession, and then you'd carefully tear it up or use it to light a cigarette, watching the truth turn to ash. There was also the temptation, a dark, cold whisper in the back of your mind to write a final letter, one to be read only if you didn't return, a last goodbye. But that was a dangerous superstition. We all felt it. Putting those words on paper felt like inviting the fate, like you were making it real, giving it a name and a place to live. So you didn't. You pushed that thought away hard. Instead, we developed our own cryptic language, codes for our despair that we prayed our families would never crack. It's been a long week, meant we'd seen things no man should see. I'm tired, meant a soul-deep exhaustion that sleep could never fix. I hope this ends soon, was a prayer, a desperate plea to a universe that seemed to have gone deaf. We hoped they just read the words and not hear the screaming between the lines. But receiving a letter, that was a different kind of magic. The sheer, heart-stopping joy of mail call. The sergeant would shout it out, and it was like a current went through the whole unit. For a few minutes we weren't soldiers, we were just boys again, hoping for a piece of home. You'd hear names, and each one was a little victory. And you'd feel that pang, a sharp little sting of jealousy for the lucky bastard who got 3 letters. But just as quickly, it would turn to shared joy when your buddy, Schmidt maybe, got a letter and a photo, his face breaking into a huge grin, yelling that his wife had had the baby, a son, and he'd pass around the tiny, blurred photograph. And for a moment, we were all uncles. We were all celebrating a new life in the middle of all this death. It was a sacred thing. When you got your own letter, you'd find a spot away from everyone, your hands almost trembling as you slit the envelope carefully, not wanting to tear a single word. You wouldn't just read it once. You'd read it a dozen times. You traced the handwriting with your finger, imagining her hand holding the pen. You could almost see her, sitting at the kitchen table, the lamp casting a warm glow, maybe biting her lip in concentration as she wrote. You'd read the words, but you'd also read the spaces, the slight smudge where a tear might have fallen, the faint impression of the pen on the paper. You soaked up every detail. The apple tree in the garden is blooming, she'd write, and you could smell the blossoms. Your mother visited yesterday, and you could see your mother's smile. But her letters had their own pain, a different kind of war. The worries about the bombing raids, the terror of the air raid sirens, the struggle with rations, the constant, gnawing fear for you. It was a cold shock sometimes to realize that the whole world was on fire, not just your small, miserable piece of it. The home you were fighting for was under siege too. It made the weight of your rifle feel even heavier. And then there was the silence, the worst part. When the mail didn't come for days, then weeks. Maybe the supply lines were cut, maybe the trucks got hit. It didn't matter why. The silence was an agony. The dark thoughts would fester in that void. Is she hurt? Is she sick? Did she stop writing? Has she forgot me? Your mind, with nothing good to feed on, would turn to the worst possible scenarios. You'd see her in trouble, scared, and you were stuck here, useless, hundreds of kilometers away. The world would get grayer, the cold would bite deeper, and the fear became a constant companion. But there was a silence even worse than that. The dreaded letter that would arrive, not for a soldier, but addressed to the unit from a mother or a young wife. Her handwriting would be neat, hopeful. I haven't heard from my son, France, in some time. Could you please tell me if he is well? And you'd have to look at the company clerk, and he'd have to look at the list, and his face would fall. And you'd know. We deburied France days ago in a makeshift grave with a crude wooden cross. Someone, usually the lieutenant, would have to write back. What could you possibly say? How do you find words for that? We'd all share the burden of that silence, a heavy, shameful quiet. We'd avoid each other's eyes, because it could be any one of us next. That was the final realization, the one that snuck up on you during a long, lonely watch in the middle of the night. These letters, this precious lifeline, they were a bridge. But they were a bridge between two worlds that had become utterly incompatible. The world of kitchen tables and apple blossoms, and the world of mud and blood and the metallic taste of fear. You could stand on the bridge, you could shout across, but you couldn't truly be in both places. And you started to understand, with a cold knot in your stomach, that if you were ever lucky enough to survive, crossing back over that bridge to the world you'd been fighting for, that would be the hardest battle of all. You were terrified that Dee brought too much of the war back with you, that the mud was caked so deep on your soul you'd never truly get it off, that you'd sit at that kitchen table and be a ghost, a stranger smelling of cordite and death in a room that smelled of perfume and bread. The letter in your pocket now felt less like a piece of home and more like a ticket to a place you weren't sure you'd ever be able to reach again. It was the weight of that hope, the terrifying lightness of that fragile paper connection that was the heaviest thing you carried. Heavier than the pack, heavier than the rifle, heavier than the body of your friend. It was the weight of a normal life, and you prayed to a God you weren't sure was listening anymore that you'd still be strong enough to carry it when, and if, you finally made it home. You never forget the cold, not that kind of cold. It's a different creature altogether from the crisp chill of a Bavarian winter, the kind you could shake off with a warm stove and a glass of schnapps. This was the cold of Russia, a living, breathing entity that hated you. It seeped through your greatcoat like it wasn't even there. It gnawed at your fingers and toes until they were white and numb, and it made the very air feel like shards of glass in your lungs. It was our most persistent enemy, long before we ever saw a Russian soldier's face. We de-huddle in our foxholes, a pathetic circle of men trying to share body heat, our breath pluming in the ghostly moonlight, stamping our feet just to feel the blood move. And one night, on sentry duty, staring out across the white expanse of Naaman's land, I saw him doing the exact same thing. A dark shape, maybe 100 meters out, a Russian sentry, stamping his feet, slapping his arms across his chest in that universal, hopeless gesture against the freeze. For a long moment, we just watched each other. There was no hatred in that look, at least not for each other. It was a look of shared misery. We were just two poor bastards, stuck in a frozen hell, pawns in a game we didn't understand. The real enemy wasn't the man across the wire. The real enemy was the frostbite that could take your fingers, the hunger that gnawed at your belly, the dysentery that left you weak and shaking. That was the first crack, you see. The first time the idea of the Bolshevik menace, my political officer, was always ranting about just evaporated. It's hard to hate a man when you see he's just as cold and scared as you are. That understanding grew a few weeks later. Rations were thin, and firewood was worth more than gold. Me and Klaus, a big, quiet farmer from the Black Forest, were sent out to scavenge what we could from a shattered village on the edge of our position. We moved carefully, our rifles slung, our eyes scanning the skeletal remains of cottages. I was pulling at a splintered doorframe when I heard eat a crunch of snow not our own. We froze. From around the corner of a collapsed brick wall, 2 Russian soldiers appeared. They froze too. For a heart-stopping second, it was just the 4 of us, standing there in the silence, our breath clouding the air between us. I could see the panic in the younger one's eyes, a mirror of my own. His hands were empty like ours. They were on the same desperate errand. My finger was on the trigger of my carabiner, and I saw his comrade's hand twitch toward the submachine gun slung on his back. But nobody moved. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Then the older Russian, a man with a thick black beard crusted with ice, made a slow, deliberate gesture. He shook his head just slightly. Then he took a step back, then another. We did the same, Klaus and I, backing away slowly, never turning our backs until the rubble separated us. Not a word was spoken. Not a shot was fired. We had just called an unspoken, temporary truce, not for kings or generals, but for the simple, primal need for a few sticks of wood to keep from freezing to death that night. We returned to our lines with our meager haul, and we never spoke of it to the lieutenant. Some things you keep to yourself. But the memory that haunts me the most, the one that still visits me in the quiet hours of the night, is the Christmas Eve of '41. The fighting had been brutal for weeks, a seesaw of attack and counterattack that had left the snow stained red. We were exhausted, hollow-eyed, our nerves stretched so thin the crack of a branch could make you jump. That night, it was eerily quiet. The artillery had stopped. The only sound was the moan of the wind across the steppe. We were huddled in our dugout, trying to muster some semblance of Christmas spirit with a canned stew that tasted of tin and defeat. And then we heard it. Faint at first, almost carried away by the wind. A voice, singing. It was a deep, resonant baritone, a slow, melancholy melody that was unmistakably Russian. We all fell silent, listening. Then another voice joined in, and another. Soon a whole chorus was singing from the Russian lines, their song drifting across the frozen wasteland that separated us. It was a folk song, I think, something about a troika and snow-covered plains. I didn't understand the words, but I understood the feeling. It was homesickness. It was the same aching emptiness I felt in my own chest. Someone in our dugout, young Hans, I think, started humming Still Nacht, quietly, almost afraid. Then another voice joined him, and then I did too. Our voices, thin and shaky, carried our own carol across to them, and for a moment the singing from their side stopped, as if they were listening to us. Then something unbelievable happened. I saw a flicker of movement. A single Russian soldier climbed out of his trench. He held his hands up empty. He took a few hesitant steps into no man's land. My heart was pounding in my throat. This was madness, a trick. But then our Feldwebel, a hardened veteran who'd been through the Great War, surprised us all. He put down his rifle. "Boys," he said, his voice rough, "it's Christmas, just for an hour." And he climbed out too. One by one we followed, leaving our weapons behind. They did the same. We met in the middle, a ragged group of young men from the Volga and the Rhine, from the Urals and the Alps, brought together in this God-forsaken place. We couldn't speak each other's language, but we didn't need to. A Russian with kind eyes and a gap-toothed smile offered me a papirosa, those cheap, strong Russian cigarettes. I gave him one of my luckies. We fumbled with lighters, our hands shaking from cold and nervousness. Someone brought out a small bottle of vodka. We passed around a flask of schnapps. We showed each other photographs, creased and worn from being handled so much. I had a picture of my mother and my sister. He had one of a young woman with dark hair, his sweetheart, he gestured. We pointed at the photos, said names. Marta, Ivan, Clara, the words hanging in the frozen air. For 1 hour we weren't German soldiers and Russian soldiers. We were just men, a bunch of freezing, frightened boys a long way from home, finding a sliver of common ground on a holy night. We shared our misery like a secret. I remember the taste of that Russian cigarette, harsh and smoky, and the warmth of the schnapps burning a path down to my frozen stomach. I remember the sound of their laughter, so similar to ours, and the sight of their faces in the moonlight, young, just like ours, etched with the same weariness. As the first hint of grey touched the eastern sky, the magic began to fade. The Feldwebel nodded to the senior Russian, a stout man with a sergeant's stripes on his ragged coat. The nod was returned. Without a word, we began to drift back to our respective lines. There were awkward smiles, a few waves. I looked back once and caught the eye of the young Russian I'd shared the cigarette with. He gave me a small, sad smile. I returned it, and then I felt it, a hot flush of shame. Shame for fraternizing with the enemy, or shame for having to go back to being enemies. I couldn't tell. It was a confusing, sickening feeling. Back in the trench, the lieutenant was waiting. "Quiet night?" he asked, his eyes narrowed. "Yes, sir," the Feldwebel grunted. "Too cold for them to bother, I suppose." We all nodded, a silent conspiracy of lies to protect that fragile, beautiful peace we had stolen. We had to protect it, because it felt like the only truly human thing we had done in months. The dawn came, cold and clear, and with it, the war returned. A whistle from an observation post, and then the world exploded. Our artillery opened up, a deafening roar that shook the ground. Shells screamed overhead to crash into the Russian lines. And 10 minutes later, the order came. Prepare for an attack. We fixed bayonets, our hands clumsy, our hearts like lead. The shrill whistle blew, and we went over the top, charging across the same ground where just hours before we had stood sharing photos and cigarettes. I was running, my breath ragged, the cold air burning my lungs, my rifle heavy in my hands. Through the smoke and chaos, I saw figures emerging from the Russian trenches, and I had to aim. I had to fire. I saw a man fall, and I didn't know if it was my bullet or the next guy's. I prayed, God forgive me. I prayed that it wasn't the boy with the gap-toothed smile. I prayed that I hadn't just killed the man whose family photo I had held in my hands. That's the real horror of war, you see. It's not the dying, though that's bad enough. It's being forced to destroy the very humanity you so desperately need to cling to. We fought all day, a bloody, brutal affair of mud and snow and screams. We gained a few hundred meters of worthless ground, and that night the cold felt colder than ever. I never saw that Russian soldier again, but his face has stayed with me all these years. In a strange way, it haunts me more than the faces of the dead I saw, more than the men I know I killed, because his face represented a possibility, a different world where we could have been friends, where we could have shared a beer instead of bullets. That single hour on Christmas Eve created a conflict in me that all the political indoctrination could never erase. The conflict between duty, which was just a fancy word for following orders to kill, and that simple, powerful human connection that transcended all the flags and all the Führers and all the commissars. It made me realize this whole bloody mess wasn't about ideologies. It was about old men sending young men to die for a few miles of dirt. For the rest of the war, through the long retreat all the way back to Berlin, I wondered about him. In the thunder of the artillery, in the silence of the night, I found myself wondering if he was still alive, if he had made it through, if he, too, was sitting in some muddy trench on the other side of the line, looking up at the same stars, remembering that one quiet night when, just for a little while, the war decided to take a holiday and we were allowed to be human again. I still wonder, even now. I like to think he made it. I like to think he has a family, grandchildren maybe, and that sometimes on a clear, cold Christmas Eve, he looks out his window and remembers too. You want to know what it was like, not the dates or the unit numbers or the grand strategy. You want to know how it felt. Let me tell you, you don't forget. Your eyes see things, your nose got the smells. But for me, it's the sounds that are still here, like ghosts living in my ears. They play over and over, a symphony I never asked to hear. People think war is loud, and it is, a hammer that never stops pounding, but it's the specific notes in that noise that carve themselves into your soul. It starts with the orchestra, a terrible orchestra of death. You learn to listen because your life depended on knowing the music. The worst, the absolute worst, was the Katyusha. The Russians called it Katyusha, we called it Stalin's organ, and the name fit because it sounded like a church organ from hell, a deep, shrieking whistle that came in a chorus. You'd hear that sound miles away, this rising scream that promised indiscriminate hell, and you knew there was no hiding from it. It wasn't aimed like an artillery shell. It was just poured over the land like boiling water. You dive into your hole, press your face into the cold, wet dirt, and just listen to the world end above you, the ground shaking like a dog shaking a rat. But other sounds were sharper, more personal. You learned the difference between the sharp, flat crack of a sniper's rifle and the deeper thud of a mortar round. The crack was a targeted thing. It meant someone somewhere had you in their crosshairs. It was intimate and cold. The thud was more impersonal, but just as deadly. And underneath it all always was the rumble. Even in the so-called quiet sectors, there was a low, constant rumble from the front, a vibration you felt more than heard, right in your teeth and bones. It was the background noise of the world tearing itself apart, and after a while you got so used to it that its absence was the most frightening thing of all. Because that's the other side of the coin, the silence. The silence that was louder than any bomb. When a barrage would stop, or you'd move to a new position, and for a few blessed minutes nothing happened, the quiet was unnatural. It was a heavy, thick silence, a vacuum that felt wrong. Your ears would be ringing from the explosions, but underneath that high-pitched whine there was nothing. No birds, no wind, just this immense, waiting stillness. And in that silence you'd strain your ears, because that's when the real fear set in. You'd listen for the faint crunch of boots on frozen ground, the grinding of T-34 tracks in the distance, the little sounds that meant the Ivans were moving, getting ready for the next push. You'd hold your breath, and all you could hear was the pounding of your own heart, a frantic drumbeat against your ribs, and the ragged, shallow breathing of the man next to you in the foxhole. Sometimes you'd hear him whispering a prayer, or just muttering "neen, neen, neen" over and over. Those were the only sounds that reminded you that you were still alive, for now. That silence was a liar. It promised respite, but it only delivered anticipation, a cold dread that coiled in your gut. You'd almost pray for the shelling to start again, just to break the unbearable tension of waiting for it. And then there were the human sounds. The sounds that connected the noise and the silence to the fact that we were all just men, boys really, caught in this meat grinder. The sound I hear most clearly, even now, is the cry for a medic. Sanitäter, sanitäter. It was a desperate, guttural sound, a voice ripped from a man's throat, and it had a way of cutting through everything: the explosions, the machine gun fire, the roar of engines. It was a sound that never failed to send a chill straight down your spine, a cold needle of fear and pity. It meant someone was hurt badly, and it reminded every one of us that it could be next. And then there was the sound a man makes when he's hit. It's not always a scream. Often, it's just a short, sharp exhalation, a grunt of surprise, like all the air and all the life was punched out of him at once. I saw Klaus, a boy from my village, get hit by a piece of shrapnel. He didn't scream. He just said, "Oh," a small, quiet sound, like he'd stubbed his toe, and then he sat down hard, looking confused before he slumped over. That little sound was more horrible than any scream. But it wasn't all terror. At night, in the foxholes, there were other sounds. The low, constant murmur of men talking, not about heroics or the fatherland, but about stupid things. They'd talk about their mother's potato pancakes, the girl they left behind, the taste of real coffee, the feel of a clean bed. It was a humming undercurrent of homesickness, a shared dream we all clung to. You'd hear the scrape of a spoon on a tin bowl, the strike of a match for a cigarette, the soft laughter at a dirty, jokier little defiance against the darkness. That was the sound of us trying to remember we were human. You think you leave it behind when the fighting stops. You come home, you take off the uniform, you try to build a life. But the war comes with you. It's in your head. A few years after the war, I was walking down a street in Berlin, trying to be a normal man again, and a truck backfired. Just a loud pop. And before I even knew what I was doing, I was on the ground, my hands over my head, my heart trying to beat its way out of my chest. People stared at me like I was a madman. I got up, brushed off my clothes, my face burning with shame, but the fear was real. It's a reflex forged in fire, etched into your nerves. I can't enjoy a fireworks display. My grandchildren, they love them, the beautiful colors lighting up the sky. But for me, the second that first rocket goes up with a whoosh and explodes with a bang, I'm not seeing colors. I'm seeing tracers cutting through the night. I'm hearing the crump of artillery. I'm smelling cordite and fear. I have to smile for them, but inside I'm back there. And the final gift, the everlasting reminder, is this ringing, a constant, high-pitched tone in my ears, always there. In the quiet of the night, when the house is still, it's the loudest thing I hear. The doctors say it's from the shelling, that there's nothing to be done. So you see, the war never really ended for me. It just changed venues. I carry the orchestra with me, every day, a permanent concert of everything I heard and everything I lost. It's the soundtrack of my youth, and it's the sound that will follow me to my grave.